Good afternoon, YouTube. Just received this shipment, and these are our idler arm bushings. So these are bronze bushings that go in steering idler arms, and I've showed you these idler arms and bushings in an earlier video. I'll put a link to that up here in the upper right corner. We just ran out of these, so I put in an order for another 160, which is enough for 80 idler arm retrofits. So these parts are designed and manufactured in the US. They do a really nice job for us. Everything is really machined, high precision, and then they pack all these up. So as is, these fit the older Duralast or McQuay Norris FA5040 idler arms, and then we also modify them to fit on the Pro-Forged idler arms, and this is the model number there, 102-10045. There's two versions of this idler arm. The older version has an L here, and the newer version has no lettering, but it's got a hole for a grease fitting. This is the newer model idler arm, and what we have to modify is we trim down the thickness of the flange. The older idler arm that has the L on it, we have to turn down the outer diameter of this by about 10/1000ths of an inch to reduce the diameter so it'll fit inside the housing. So we're supporting three different kinds of idler arms. We have to take the raw bushing, which fits one style, and we make one modification to fit one kind of idler arm, and we make a different modification to fit a different type. So we're working on retrofitting another idler arm here with our bronze bushings right there. So these are the plastic bushings that come with the Pro-Forged idler arm, and you can see how loose these bushings are compared to our bushings here. In fact, this one, there's so much paint or powder coating on this shaft that I can't even get this bushing on. So one thing I'm going to have to do is clean up this shaft with some sandpaper to remove the excess paint. You want a snug fit, but you don't want to have to press this on so hard that you'll never be able to get it off. So the way this came from the factory, you had this washer on here that was tightened down on the shaft threads, and then there was a nut that went in there. You can see how the nut was tightened down so hard that it deformed the washer, and you can see it's almost a cup-shaped washer there. If you use that cupped washer like that, there's a good portion of the bushing that's not being contacted by the washer. You're just riding right on the very center there and not putting the clamping force over the whole face of the bushing. You could flip it over, but then you're just going to be riding on the outside of the bushing and not on the insides. You could flatten that out, and that will help a bit, but you can see that's a soft steel washer. It's not hardened or anything. So the other problem with this washer is it's kind of a tight fit, you know, now that it's been deformed a little bit, but it spins on there. So we had a customer recently named Andrew, and he had a really good suggestion. What he had done was he took this washer and flattened it out, and then actually went through the process of lapping this flat on a piece of sandpaper, and then he put the nut on, and then used a welder and put like 3 tack welds to weld the nut and washer together so that they would move as a whole. So if the washer gets stuck to the bushing, you're going to have the nut moving on the washer, so you'll have a steel on steel friction versus a steel on plastic or bronze. So he had the really neat idea that perhaps we could find a flange nut. So this nut has a heavy hardened steel flange, and it's very smooth. And so when you tighten that down on the bushing, Now the flange and the nut move together because they're one piece. So we also ship a thin jam nut that can go on the end of the shaft, and then you can lock these two nuts together, holding the large nut and then tightening the jam nut until it locks. You could also apply some thread locking compound on the nut if you wanted to do it that way. Anyway, we're going to try putting one of these together with these flange nuts and see how that works. This one, the housing is a nice fit on this bushing. Sometimes there's a little extra paint or powder coating inside the housing that you have to remove. So yeah, let me clean up the shaft with some sandpaper, and then we'll show fitting the bushings on there, because right now it won't go in there. I think they probably either paint or powder coat these hanging upside down, and sometimes you get extra paint down here on the end. So I'm just going to sand that off. It takes a few minutes to clean it up, and you just keep going until the bushing slides in fairly easily. And the way I clean it up is I just have a block with some sandpaper on it and just go around and around. It hasn't been taken down completely to bare metal, but just enough you can slide the bushing down. You can see this end, I haven't touched the paint much at all, and that one's fine. It's just up here. Get a little extra paint. So one thing is, if you're going to use a thread locker on here, you want to make sure the threads are clean, because you get grease on there when you take them apart and put them back together. Clean them off good now, and then when you put everything back together, you're going to get some grease on the threads as you shove it through. So make sure to wipe the threads clean, maybe even use some acetone or isopropyl alcohol and clean those threads off, because the thread locker needs clean threads to seal. If you're going to use the jam nut and the regular nut, you don't really have to worry about getting the threads super clean. Okay, YouTube, so I applied a little bit of grease inside the housing and then slid the two bushings in. So, and then the other thing I like to do is put a little bit of grease on the faces here, because your arm is going to be rubbing down here. That's on this end, is the base of the arm. So now here's the flange nut. So you're just going to screw that on. This nut is built to be kind of a lock nut. It's got slightly deformed threads. It'll tend to stay tight by itself. So you can see now the nut and the flange are rotating and the bushing is staying still. So the bushing is doing its job. All the friction is between the washer and the bushing, and then inside it's the shaft and the bushing. So the bushing sits still inside the housing, and then the whole shaft, nut, and washer move inside the bushings. And then you can see we couldn't use a lock nut there because there's not enough thread left. So, yeah, so at this point you have the two options. One is you could have applied some thread locking compound like red or blue Loctite to the threads before you screwed the nut on, or you can use this jam nut here. So that's just a thin nut that's going to be tightened over the end here. Get your desired tightness here, and then you're going to tighten this jam nut, and that'll jam against this flange nut and then keep them from loosening up. The original setup, you can see how the nut has moved on the washer and left that circle there. So yeah, thank you, Andrew, for the suggestion. I think those nuts are going to work out well. Basically, at the end, after we've put the bushings in, we give you the old nut and washer. We give you the original bushings, and then there's also the grease fitting here that goes in there, and the cotter pin, and then we put the cap back on, but we don't put it on fully, because one thing you probably want to do is install this on your truck. So you're going to bolt this to the frame on the passenger side. You're going to hook this up to the steering, and then you're going to want to cycle the steering back and forth a few times and get this thing moving the tires and pushing and pulling and twisting, you know, doing whatever it's going to do. And then check the tightness here. We basically just put the nut on just so it's there, and then we put the cap on just loosely so that you can take it off, make any adjustments if you need to, if you want to do thread locking compound. We just basically put it in place to make sure everything's going to move. We give you the cap back like that. We give you the original parts. You're still going to have to install this on your truck, and then it's a good idea to run the steering through a few cycles and maybe even drive it a bit, and then check these nuts and also check the bolts through the frame, make sure they're still tight, but also check this one. You know, there might have been a little bit of paint that wore off on either end. So anyway, yeah, that's our new setup with a flange nut and then a jam nut and the bronze bushings. So yeah, one of the things we do on the Pro-Forged bushings is we thin the flange of the bushing. So these are the original Pro-Forged bushings, and these flanges are about 2 millimeters thick. So we set the bronze bushings up and shave down the flange until it's similar thickness to the original bushings. So instead of having the stock washer that domes out when you tighten it down, you now have a flange nut that's all one piece, and it's solid forged steel instead of a stamped sheet metal washer and a regular lock nuts. Yeah, there's our new setup. So yeah, if you have any other questions about the idler arms, post up in the comment section below. I'll put a link to our web page that has all the contact details and all the technical information on these, installation notes and the whole 9 yards. Check that out. And as always, thanks for watching.